Okay. Well, thank you so much to MASTS for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. Indeed, this talk is going to be about my PhD project, which I studied at SAMS, as Hannah said, with funding through SAMS, UHI, NatureScot, and MASTS. And my supervisory team, the researchers I worked with for this project, were Stephen Benjamins, Ben Wilson, and Caroline Carter. And just as a wee side note, there are unpublished results in this talk, and in certain slides you might see some no pictures or no tweets symbols. So just keep an eye out for those, and please don't share those. That would be fantastic. So getting straight into it, how might fish farms affect cetaceans? And cetaceans obviously are mobile animals. They move through the marine environment, and they do come into contact with aquaculture. So these aquaculture facilities may provide additional foraging opportunities. They may attract fish or other resources that cetaceans can feed upon. They also potentially more negatively can cause displacement through habitat loss or disturbance. Obviously, these facilities take up space and habitats often inhabited by cetaceans. And the sort of activities that go on at fish farms or aquaculture facilities might disturb these animals from areas that they use. There's also the possibility of entanglement risk. You can see some pictures that I put on slides there that are quite dramatic. These just does tend to impact the larger cetacean species more than the smaller ones. But that being said, there's still the possibility for accidents and entanglement. And of course, exposure to the farm activities, the things that go on at a normal fish farm or aquaculture site may reduce fitness. So with the pictures that you can see there, there's examples from all over the world. I've included mainly finfish farming facilities there, so salmon farms or sea bass farms in the Mediterranean. And yeah, the bottom one is actually a situation in Scotland that happened in 2014 with a humpback that got entangled beneath a salmon farm in your Mull. So in Scotland, the west coast in particular has a very high density of harbour porpoise. And it's one of the highest densities in Europe. And because of this, there was a special area of conservation established to protect porpoise habitat. And this extends right from the Minch in the north right down to Kintyre. And it can and does overlap quite considerably with the sites of salmon farms. And salmon farms in Scotland are raising Atlantic salmon, so Salmo, salar. And they consist of raising these salmon initially on land. And after they reach a certain size, they are moved out to sea, where they are grown further in open net cages, which are float upon the sea surface. The nets themselves can get down to 12 meters of depth. And the cages themselves can be a couple of 100 meters in diameter, so they can be quite large. The salmon then stay at sea for around 2 years to mature before they're harvested. And there are efforts actually to reduce this time to make the grow out period shorter. So salmon farms in Scotland have another issue associated with them, in that they sometimes use acoustic deterrent devices. And these are devices used to deter seals from approaching salmon farms and predating upon the stock. These devices are currently, at the moment, the use of the devices in the industry is a changing situation. And currently only certain types of devices are being used. However, at the time of the study, there were not many restrictions on ADD type use or the output regime of the noise at salmon farms, and a number of my study sites did use them. So modelling and other studies have shown that use of acoustic deterrent devices can possibly cause damage to hearing level thresholds, and that previously the use of these devices were pervasive across the west coast of Scotland, as you can see from that figure. So how might porpoises interact with salmon farms in Scotland? And this comes down to a number of different aspects of salmon farming and how this could impact, or how animals, harbour porpoises could interact with that. So first of all, farm activity. Does the daily regimes of farms impact porpoise presence? Do the use of boats or the presence of workers on board the facilities impact use of that area? Or potentially the installation or removal of cages could possibly impact porpoise presence. And then, of course, you've got acoustic deterrent devices. Can passive acoustic monitoring, which I'll touch upon a little bit later, can that technique be used to detect porpoises when the devices are being used? And do the use of acoustic deterrent devices impact detection rates? And finally, farms as fish aggregating devices or artificial reefs. In many areas of the world, there are many studies that show that fish farms, mainly fin fish farms in particular, can attract wild fish and in turn be prey for other predators. The situation is less clear in Scotland. However, there is that possibility that fish farms do aggregate prey that could be prey for porpoises. So in light of all this information, there were a number of different questions that I had in my research that I looked to try and answer. So firstly, it was a very interesting question to ask what salmon farms actually sound like. The kind of activities that go on in a salmon farm, what are the acoustic signatures? And is that a situation where farms are sounding similar across the board, or the differences there? Secondly, what methods can actually be used to look into the wild fish question at salmon farms in Scotland? As I said previously, this is a topic that hasn't really been looked at in much detail. So it was very interesting to establish whether this could be looked at in this project, and whether we could answer a question of whether there might be prey for porpoises around salmon farms. Thirdly, can porpoises be detected by passive acoustic monitoring at farms? This hadn't really been done in any kind of large scale before, so it was unclear whether this was going to work. Fourthly, what factors actually influence detection of porpoises? If indeed we put these techniques and methods out on the farms to detect the animals, are there certain factors that influence these detections, and are there patterns that can be taken out of those data? And finally, can porpoises be localized using passive acoustic monitoring at farms? And localization is essentially getting fine-scale movements of animals moving around a particular area. And this can be done using acoustics, and however, it has not been done at fish farms before, so it was interesting to be able to look into that question as well. So my study sites, I had 8 fish farms spread throughout the Firth of Lorne and throughout the Sound of Mull. And these were owned by 2 operators, Scottish Sea Farms and Maui. And at the time, all the farms were at different stages of the rearing process. So there were some farms that were fallow, some that were stocked with small fish, some that were nearing the end of their harvest periods, where the fish were quite large. And throughout the monitoring, which was conducted between 2018 and 2020, all the stages of salmon rearing went on their usual pattern. So the farms came in and out of fallowing periods, came in and out of being stocked with different sizes of salmon. One of the sites in particular actually was not technically a fish farm, but it was an old disused broodstock site, essentially where they previously had been raising and keeping large adult salmon to breed. And these were broodstock fish. And that was happening at that site of Lunga up until 2015. And after that, the site was disused. So technically speaking, it could have been seen as a little bit of a control site, in that there was a disused farms facility there, but not actually any fish on site. So I've talked a lot about passive acoustic monitoring so far, but not really described exactly what it is. So passive acoustic monitoring can also be known as PAM. And this is a technique used to study cetaceans, because cetaceans produce vocalizations. And porpoises are an echolocating species, which means that they produce an echolocation click in a similar way to bats to navigate, communicate, and hunt in the underwater environment. Porpoises are quite interesting in that they produce very stereotypical echolocation clicks, very much focused around the 130 kilohertz frequency. This is way higher than we can hear, so you really do need specialized tools to detect those calls. And these tools are known as hydrophones, which are essentially underwater microphones, and these can be used underwater to detect vocalizations of porpoises. And in this study, I used two types of hydrophone. One was known as the C-pod, which is a click logger, essentially designed particularly for echolocating click producing species like the harbour porpoise. I also used a different type of acoustic monitoring system called the sound trap, which is a broadband acoustic recorder, and that basically records everything within in the environment and allows you to look at the kind of soundscape of the environment, pulling out anything you want, including harbour porpoise clicks. So this equipment I just deployed from the feeding barges of the fish farms. So fish Atlantic salmon farms typically have these floating vessel-like structures called barges where the food is stored. And this offered a perfect platform to deploy my passive acoustic monitoring equipment. So jumping straight into the first of these questions, what do salmon farms sound like? So through the use of broadband recorders, which allow me to detect and record a very broad range of acoustic activity, many of the activities at the farms could be identified and characterized. So I'm going to show you a few examples here. Basically, what I'm showing you here are spectrograms and waveforms, which is our way of showing the distribution of sound. And it gives you a kind of visualized representation of that sound. And I do have the ability to play these, which I will try and do, but I'll warn you, they are quite quiet. So if you don't hear too much, don't worry, it's not your speakers, it's probably just the sound that's a little bit low. So the first example are small boats moving around farms. And this was very, very common because boats are pretty much the only way that staff can get to and from the farm, as well as conduct maintenance around the farm. And this was very, very common to record. This is just a wee example, if I can. So hopefully you heard a wee bit there. Basically, it sounds like engine revving. Quite commonly, you would get quite transient noises of gear changes, which was quite interesting to see. And a lot of cavitation you could see from the propellers moving in the water, resulting in quite broad band signals. And when the boats got really close to the hydrophone, you often got interference with that hydrophone, which gave a very interesting pattern known as the Lloyd mirror effect. Another really common activity that went on at fish farms was the cleaning of the nets. Now, this is basically done to get biofouling off of the net surface. And to do this, they use very high pressure water cleaners. And this was quite apparent from the recordings, and it happened quite frequently. I'll just try and play a wee example of that. So yeah, that hopefully you could hear a little bit of that. It does sound a bit like a jet pressure washer, and that was quite a common signal to find at farms as well. So another very interesting thing was to find the characteristic of the feeder systems. Now, these feeder systems are used to feed the fish. They're air driven usually, where the feed within the barge is blown with high pressure into each of the sea cages and pens out in the sea. And this was quite typical. You would get pulses of noise and characterized by broadband signals with center frequencies of around 3 kilohertz. Once the startup cycle, where the system actually begins and starts to build up that air pressure, the signals got longer, and up to 30 seconds of pulsing with a kind of center frequency of 4 kilohertz. That's not what it sounds like. I apologize. I will try and play a wee bit of this. This is a little bit low, but I will try and play a little bit there. So you might have just been able to catch that. It's kind of like dropping rice into a container, and each of that those noises is essentially the pellets, the fish feed, moving through the pipes, which is very interesting. So next we have a few more things that I managed to record. On some of the farms that used acoustic deterrent devices, obviously I got a lot of recordings of these. These were quite interesting in that the frequencies really went quite high. You had the center frequencies of around 10 kilohertz, but sometimes these harmonics would reach much, much higher. I'll try and play a wee example of that. So that should have sounded kind of like a clicking sound. That is essentially the individual pulses of the ADD noise, and each pulse is quite short, of only about 45 milliseconds for this particular type of ADD. And there were plenty of mystery noises as well, which didn't really fit into any kind of activity category that I could work out. And if anyone does know what this mystery sound is, if you can hear it, please do let me know, because I'm still not sure what it is. It might remain a mystery. I'll try and play that as well. So that sounds really like a scraping. To me, I was asking the fish farmers whether they were scraping anything within the barge, but not, apparently they weren't. So something, possibly a marine animal making a noise that we don't know what that is. So as well as these individual noises and descriptions of kind of activities, I did want to kind of look at the long-term soundscape of a farm. What kind of noises, how do all these activities and noises contribute to that soundscape essentially? So what I did for this was I produced long-time average spectrograms, which is basically the distribution of noise energy across frequency bands. And in this figure, the triangles at the top represent sunrise and sunset. And this is 10 days recorded at a fish farm as it transitioned from a fallow period to a stocked period. So they were basically gearing up, getting ready to introduce fish into that farm. And it's great. You can see lots of different things going on here. You can see the farm starts to go much more active towards the 1st of November. But in between, you get intermittent activity, and this is shown through this spectrogram. So you can see low frequency generators at around 25 hertz, right at number 1. You can see that pointed out there, and 50 hertz as well. You can actually see a bit of net cleaning, and that's number 2, and that kind of red color there, just broadband net noise coming from net cleaning. And it does push up into the ultrasonic frequencies of over 20 kilohertz. You've also got a wee tiny bit of boat sonar going on at number 3 there, which is highlighted at the top. And that was up to 150 kilohertz, which is obviously ultrasonic as well. And then very interestingly, although maybe not quite as clear, you can actually see porpoise clicks at this farm between the 27th and 28th, highlighted in number 4. So this is a great way of showing the distribution of this noise across time at a fish farm. So we've looked at the soundscape, we've kind of got an idea of what noises and activities go on there. I also wanted to investigate the fish, the possibility for wild fish to be at a farm. So I explored this using two methods: acoustic imaging with a multi-beam sonar camera and a baited remote underwater video system. And the acoustic imaging camera is basically a system which emits multiple sound beams at extremely high frequencies. We're talking megahertz, 1.1 to 1.8 megahertz. And these sound pulses go through a specialized acoustic lens and convert the returning echoes to the unit to digital images. And it can result in lovely video-like images which help you count and identify fish species. The other system is a baited camera, which uses just visual camera system to image fish that are attracted to a bait. And there were two types available for my study. One that was used really for imaging skate, so very large species of skate, and a slightly smaller spherical system, which is the right-hand one, originally designed to image benthic seaweed aggregations and flame shell beds. So I explored this question using these methodologies, and I used two farms. One was stocked with fish and one was fallow. So I have a little example here of, this is the recorded tracks from our acoustic imaging survey of one of the stocked farms. And you can see on the left is a map of the transects that we covered, and each of the dots represents a fish event. And a fish event basically is when a fish entered the field of view and could be counted as a separate event if there was 30 seconds elapsing between each event. And the time of entry and exit was used to estimate the percentage of the survey time that contained the fish events. And the fish were also counted, although it was much easier to count the larger, less aggregated species than the small ones. As you can see on the images on the right, you've got a small shoal of 5 fish, and then a very, very dense shoal of much smaller fish. And it's very difficult to enumerate those images. So I had to estimate for those kind of images. These single shoals could obviously be over 200 or more individuals. So essentially, because of the survey that was done, statistical analyses were not conducted on a farm and control site, but it did give us an idea of what you could find at a site. Sorry, yeah, I absolutely should have mentioned that the farms that I used also had an associated control site a certain distance away. The idea was to try and look at both. So with the baited underwater cameras, we used different types of bait, a macro bait and a fish feed bait from the salmon farms. That was an idea to try and establish or a kind of unknown whether fish would be attracted to fish feed if they were frequently exposed to it from the farm above. And mackerel's often used because it's a nice oily fish and it produces a nice aroma, and you get a lot of fish coming into there. So I found that there were quite a few species that came in. I had nephrops, so Norway lobster, I had whiting, cat shark, grey gurnards, flatfish species, a thornback ray, and harbour crabs, amongst other invertebrates. By far the most common imaged at all of the sites was the whiting, and these were quite small juvenile whiting of around 10 centimetres or so. So these graphs are just showing the species arriving at the underwater camera at each of the sites. So max n is counting the maximum number of individuals within the field of view, and this is done for the species and for individuals. And so most individuals, fish, were found at the non-stocked farm, and most species were found at the stocked control site. And it was found that actually the mackerel and the fish feed were quite similar in how many species were coming and how many individuals were coming to the camera. And yes, so the most common was also the whiting, which was by far the most imaged fish species. So I'll touch upon the kind of conclusions of like each of these questions towards the end, but essentially, so we'd covered our soundscape. We'd had a wee look at what kind of fish species and the methods you could use to look at fish underneath salmon farms. We had to establish whether porpoises could actually be detected by passive acoustic monitoring using these underwater microphones, using these hydrophones. So this is now turning to my click logger, so not my broadband, but my click logger, and it is called the C-pod. And they're very useful for getting detections from echolocating cetaceans. And just this is a little kind of graph of what a porpoise click train looks like on C-pod, the data that comes from a C-pod. And it's very stereotypical click pattern in a very tight frequency band around the 130 kilohertz frequency band. And this is very indicative of a harbour porpoise around your C-pod. So yes, essentially, once I'd made the first deployments of C-pods at the beginning of the project in 2018, it was found that I could actually detect porpoises using this equipment, which was fab. That was great. We knew then I could carry on with that project using that equipment. However, there was a bit of an issue. So these two very colourful graphs are representations of data logged over multiple days at 2 different salmon farms. And what's most important to note here is the black line. And on the first graph, the black line is right at the bottom and it has multiple peaks. And this black line actually indicates the number of clicks detected within that period. So you, in the settings of the C-pod, you could detect 4,096 clicks per minute. And after which, if you went over that number of clicks in the environment, the C-pod would stop logging momentarily, and that would help it save on memory. Now, this is usually very useful, and it stops you losing memory. It allows you to deploy your C-pod for a long period of time. However, I was finding that this was causing a problem at salmon farms. So the graph below, instead of these nice peaks of clicks, you can see that it's flatlining. And that's essentially telling me that the number of clicks per minute recorded were surpassing that click limit, and the logger was not really recording or detecting and logging information during those minutes. It was continually pausing until the next minute, finding there's too many clicks, and then pausing again. So this was basically causing a bit of an issue with effort. And what's really interesting here is that whatever is causing this, in the lower graph, you can see stops just after day 10, and the system can then start logging again, as you can see the small peaks in click numbers. So I termed this saturation, and this was definitely an issue because it meant that I was not logging and detecting, and the effort wasn't as great at farms where this was occurring. So yeah, just a wee pointer there. So in order to try and mitigate for this, I started to explore different modifications to C-pod settings. So basically your standard C-pod has a frequency range of 20 to 160 kilohertz, so they're ultrasonic. And as I said, they have this 4,096 click limit per minute. And luckily for me, these can be modified and these can be changed. So when a farm is quite noisy, this click limit can fill and the unit stops logging. So I had to explore different ways of doing this. And that's your standard C-pod there, your click limit filled, and then no logging for the remainder of that minute, and that's a loss of effort. So any kind of those data are useful but not excellent because we've got times where the unit was not logging. So to push these modifications, I explored doing different things, and that included raising that click limit as far as we go, trying to make sure that the seapod wouldn't reach a predetermined click limit by pushing it right up to 65,000 clicks, which is a lot. And also changing the frequency distribution that the seapod was focusing on. So trying to really narrow it down into the more porpoisey frequencies simply so it would try and ignore things that weren't porpoise, which was, of course, the aim of the studies, trying to work out porpoise detections around farms. So that's the wee figure on the left. You just kind of have an idea of what this restriction of this frequency is, where you're narrowing it down into a C, just shows you how you've narrowed that frequency down into the ones that you're interested in. So what I found was that when I combined a frequency, a bandpass filter, essentially, what it's termed, with a click limit, this really did improve the situation, and it allowed the seapod to log data without reaching this saturation and without reaching this point where it wouldn't log. And the graph shows the outcome of one of the experiments that I conducted to test this, where an artificial porpoise signal was emitted at a farm with ADDs, acoustic deterrent devices, at different distances from seapods, with the standard setting versus this combined alternate seapod setting. And ultimately, the combined setting was better at detecting all of the emitted signals up to 200 meters, and it lost no time to any saturation. So this was exactly the sort of thing, the tool I would need to deploy at farms that had a little bit of noise associated with them. So getting into the kind of the ecological side of things, where we're looking at what factors were influencing all the detections that I was seeing. So as I said, I had 8 sites, and the seapods were deployed between May 2018 and April 2020, just past the start of the pandemic. So obviously data collection after that was not really possible, and it was kind of the end of the project, but it did give a really nice long-term data set. Just a few pictures of various outfits and deployments, which was very, very exciting. And yeah, so we had these 8 sites, long-term data sets from each. And initially, it was important to examine the raw data. And when I did that, there was a lot of evidence for interfarm variability between the porpoise detections, and evidence for high porpoise activity sites and evidence for lower. So this is an example of a high porpoise activity site. And the top graph is basically showing you the effort of your seapod, where the kind of brighter colours are where less time was logged, and the kind of grey or the darker colours are more time is logged. So just shows you the kind of, basically this is really associated with farm activity. The more noise at a farm, the more likely it is you may lose a little bit of time on your seapod. And the graph below is basically your porpoise positive minutes per hour. And this is showing you how many detections you were getting within each hour. And you can see that it's quite a lot. You're getting a little bit of a pattern there. The lines at the bottom and top of each graph are actually sunrise and sunset. And these data are right the way from 2018 to 2020. So this is a full long-term data set. Compare this to the right-hand side. This is very much what I would term a low porpoise site. The bottom graph, if you compare, really not many detections when you compare it to the left-hand graph. And also you can see there's a lot more going on in terms of effort on the top graph. You've got a lot more time lost. Essentially, that came down to the use of ADDs, which did not allow for proper monitoring during those times. So this site had fewer porpoise detections, and I would have termed that a lower porpoise detection site. So it's quite a good way to see the impact of ADD use at farms simply in terms of effort, not in terms of porpoise activity, because you've got to remember that this is showing you when your sea pods aren't actually necessarily logging very much. So the fact that we have a bare patch of no detections beneath an ADD time frame doesn't necessarily mean the animals weren't there. It means that the unit was not capable of logging them because it wasn't logging for enough time because of the noise output. So there really was poor monitoring effort duration during these kind of periods. You can see at the top, I have towards July 2019, I began to start using the combined sea pod, which was modified in order to try and cope with this kind of acoustic environment. And that does help quite a bit, and it stopped you from losing that effort and that monitoring effort. So once I'd collected all of these data, it was really important to try and establish what environmental factors and possibly farm factors that might have influenced detections at each of the farms. So I used a modelling technique called a generalised additive model with generalised estimating equations, GAM-Gs, and I used porpoise positive hours as a binary response in this model. It's a really good method to use because it's very good for data that may be temporarily autocorrelated, and you can use the presence and absence of porpoise detection as a binary response, which I did here. So what I did was use environmental variables taken from the Westcombs model, which is a fantastic back and forecast environmental model produced for SAMS at SAMS, and it can produce a whole lot of environmental variables across the west coast of Scotland. And I used this model to include wind speed, salinity and temperature at my sites across the time that the data set, the seapod data set was for. I also used a few other data sources, including tidal data and moon phase data. I'm also looking at sun altitudes, which is the height of the sun in relation to the horizon. There were also seapod related data, including the hour of day and temporal factors, the effort associated with the seapod as well, and farm related variables such as staff presence and whether the farm was stocked or fallow. So this involved a lot of work because there were 8 sites, but 14 model iterations, which was basically so that I could model the normal seapod separately to the special combined seapod, simply because those units are different and you wouldn't want to assume that they were going to give you the same results. So I modeled those data sets separately. And this is basically the kind of the wide scale result, separating out these. And the top 3 covariates retained across all of these models were dial hour, sun altitude, and water temperature. And these relate to diurnal and seasonal variation in detection probability. The covariates didn't always show the same patterns. So each site didn't necessarily always have porpoises at the same time of day. It was quite different, but generally speaking, higher detection probability of porpoises occurred in the early morning and evening than during the day. And however, for sun altitude and for water temperature, the patterns differed quite a lot within and between the farms. And within the models, the models are basically an observer relationship, and once you've got that output, the relationship is actually dependent on the variables preceding the one that comes out of the model, so they're not considered separately in this type of model. So just looking a wee bit more into some case studies. This is Portnacrow, one of my farm sites off the northwest coast of Shoonagh Island near Cruvehaven. It was the smallest farm in the study, 4 cages and no ADDs. And it went from fallow to stocked during the study. It has 1,000 tons of permitted Atlantic salmon biomass. It's a tidal channel with a steep drop of off to 70 metres towards the northwest side of the farm. And it's got this very unusual barge type called the seascape barge, which is a little cylindrical design, quite different to some of the larger farms. So these are model outputs from this farm. And these graphs are basically showing you the probability of echolocation detection, with 1 being higher probability and 0 being lower. This example is a standard seapod, and the black lines beneath the graph, beneath the red line, are rug plots, and these show the spread of the raw data. So this is over a year's worth of data, and the covariates listed here are ordered in order of most importance. And at this site, during this time between June 2018 and May 2019, and then on from July to August, the most important variable was water temperature, where water temperature at 12 degrees had a higher likelihood of higher probability of echolocation detection, including as well then thereafter higher salinities, slightly higher wind speeds, when the seapod was at an angle greater than 0 degrees, and also the increased detections were likely at greater and fewer total minutes logged by the seapod, which was quite interesting. Most detections early morning and evening, and lowest at the night time, and highest around sunrise and sunset, and after the first and second neap tides. So you can see just from this one farm with this spread of data that this is a quite complicated situation. And this was one of the main takeaways from this study, was that each of these farms are very different, and they're very variable in the detection patterns that you can see. So I'm really quickly going to compare that to the same farm model, but for the combined seapod, for the special seapod. This, instead of the mirroring exactly the same results, showed actually that sun altitude was the most important factor that influenced echolocation probability, with a much higher probability at sunset and sunrise than when the sun was below the horizon or above it. So in this particular system, there was no tidal parameters retained, and salinity was not retained either. So it's really important to look at these, and it emphasizes the complexity of animal presence at this particular site and others. So one very interesting thing that came out of this, so because of the issues of monitoring using seapods when ADDs were being used, there was not really the opportunity to look at porpoise presence before or after or during use of ADDs. That was just simply because of the methods used and the equipment used. Now, knowing how seapods can be modified, that question could potentially be looked at further. However, there was evidence of porpoise presence during ADD use. While the seapods were obviously negatively impacted, sometimes the seapod would log a small portion of that minute before it stopped logging. And in those small periods of time, I occasionally found a number of instances where porpoises were actually detected during these ADD signals. And this really colourful graph is essentially showing you porpoise click trains, which are in purple, in amongst ADD output noise, which is the kind of greens and the reds that you're seeing. So that shows you that for some of the time, some animals may be present around ADDs. The seapods can detect porpoises out to 300 metres, so 300 metres within the range of that ADD, and that they may be exposing themselves to potentially introduced noise levels for some of the time. But of course, like I said earlier, it's because of the monitoring effort issues, it was not possible to get an idea of how frequently this would happen. And porpoises do echolocate very frequently, almost continuously. So there is a small possibility that this is an underestimate of presence when ADDs are on. So overall, the kind of main take homes from this is that there were really varying detection rates, and the factors that influence detection probability, most common ones were seasonal factors, sun altitude and water temperature, and diurnal patterns recurring over 24 hours, which would be your dial hour. These variables that were retained and found mirror that are seen in other places where porpoises have been detected interacting with man-made structures such as oil and gas structures, renewable structures, bridges, and actually fish farms in Canada as well. One other interesting thing was that fish farm related variables such as the production phase, whether the farm was with fish or without, or whether the staff were present or not, didn't seem to widely influence the detection probabilities. So finally, we've moved through our soundscape to wild fish using the tools of passive acoustic monitoring and looking at how porpoises are using these environments. There was a final question about the real kind of fine scale use of these habitats. How do the animals interact with farm infrastructure and their position within the water column? So in collaboration with a researcher from the Max Planck Institute in Germany, I installed a 16-element hydrophone array, which was deployed at 2 salmon farms for around a week each. And the linear setup that you can see on the left is basically all the little hydrophones strung out along a line. And this provides your depth of the animal from the array and its distance from the array, but it doesn't provide its bearing. So it gives you your 2 different types of information. And you use a special calculation called the time of arrival distance between each of the porpoise clicks arriving on each of those hydrophones, which are back calculated to provide you the position of that animal within the water column. So this was a brand new technique. This has not been used on fish farms before for porpoises, so it was really an unknown. But ultimately, it was a successful deployment. But there were quite a lot of challenges associated with using this method. The equipment uses a power source, and luckily for us, the managers of the farms were happy to leave the diesel generators on to provide power for the system. But there was also the issue with the equipment getting wet, but also not overheating. So there was quite a lot of trying out of different methods. The little video which is ongoing is basically porpoise clicks coming into that system after we set it up, those vertical lines right there. And we were very happy about that. That was a celebration because this had not been done before and we weren't sure it was going to work. Because there were so many hydrophones as well, the volume of data collected was also very, very high. Over 6 terabytes of data collected, maybe up to 8 actually, if I had the time to try and let the computer figure out how much there is. So that was very, very data heavy, and it has to be considered for techniques like this. But ultimately, it was interesting and successful because the system was wirelessly set up so we could control it when we weren't actually on the barge, which was a really interesting way to conduct this kind of research. So this is just a small example of the kind of data that comes out of this using this technique. A customized script was used in MATLAB to identify the click trains and actually choose likely trains for localization. Not all trains can be localized. You really do need ones that are high quality and loud. Otherwise, the algorithm can't put that into a location and localize it. The graph on the right-hand side is actually showing you your depth and your distance of an animal across a few seconds. And below it is your CPOD data showing you a click train, and the star indicates which click train was actually used for that localization. So these experiments showed that this technology can be used to determine fine-scale movements of porpoises around salmon farms, but obviously there were challenges and issues associated with it. And one of the main challenges we found were the echolocation clicks were sometimes out with the detection range of the array, and they were quite quiet, which really did reduce how many successful localizations we could get from these data. So what does this all mean? Essentially, salmon farm activities have different acoustic signatures, and that can include diesel generators, net cleaners, ADDs, and boat use. It's likely that some of these activities can be perceived by porpoises, and this is the first study to characterise these signals at operational salmon farms in Scotland. Additionally, methods to explore survey techniques for wild fish at salmon farms found that both acoustic imaging and grub-spatted remote underwater cameras can be used, and it does emphasise the need for multiple replicate observations at both control and farm sites to get good comparisons of what's going on. Pelagic shoals of fish and individual fish of unknown species were found by the imaging sonar, while the broad deployments found that the most commonly observed species was whiting. And of course, these techniques can be honed and used for other studies in the future. Seapods can be modified to work effectively in high noise environments, such as salmon farms using ADDs. And this is really just combining a bandpass filter, so a narrow frequency band, and a click limit increase, which prevents the seapod from saturating and having monitoring effort loss. There's a couple of wee caveats with that, in that the clip classifier might work slightly differently on the seapod, and the deployment length can be reduced. So, big takeaway from all of the long-term data is that inter-farm variability in porpoise detection is really apparent. Basically, porpoises are most likely present at farms during the evening hours at dawn and dusk, and particularly during the summer months between May and September. And the data revealed that some porpoises are approaching salmon farms during ADD use as well, indicating some animals could be exposing themselves to injurious noise levels. And finally, hydrophone arrays can be used to detect porpoises at fish farms, and this method should definitely be explored further in the future. So the work presented here shows that porpoises occur in close proximity to salmon farms off the Scottish west coast, and this is similar to findings in other regions that show the species interacting with anthropogenic structures. There is a potential impact of the industry upon the species, and this should be considered. However, the present study cannot or could not establish disturbance from ADD use at the study sites. However, observations were made of close range occurrence to active devices. Further research with seapod modifications and monitoring at farms with ADDs could answer the question of displacement or occurrence around devices. However, there is already quite an established literature resource on this already. And sound level measurements at farms, which was not one of the parts of my soundscape work, could identify the contribution of the identified signals to the overall sound and soundscape. Further work it would be really interesting to establish do farms attract and congregate wild fish, and the strength of attraction for predators like porpoises and seals as well, and which would also help us understand depredation by seals as well. So ultimately, this research provides further information that may help advise the rapidly changing policy landscape around fish farms and inform the ongoing debate about the ways in which the salmon aquaculture industry can sustainably develop, while also maintaining the west coast of Scotland as a stronghold of international importance for the harbour porpoise. And that is me finished. Thank you very much for your time and your attention, and I'm very happy to take any questions from now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Texa. That was a lot of research questions that you were working through for your PhD. You were doing a bit of ecology, a bit of technical work, lots of data analysis. You were really ticking a lot of boxes with that. We're going to leave your details on the screen for just a minute longer, just so that if anyone wants to get in contact with you, they can. We've got a question in the Q&A box right now. And if you have a question that you would like to ask Texa, then please just pop it in the Q&A box in the chat. The Q&A box allows us to see the questions that are being asked. I can see a question in there already. So let's just jump straight into it. So let's just... and of course, this is being recorded. So if there's something that you would like to recap that Texa said, then please just check out the MASTS YouTube channel. The recording might be a little modified just due to those images that Texa was sharing that they haven't been published just yet. But let's go into that first question, which was from Vincent, which said, so this related to, I think, when you had debated cameras on slide 16. It's the question is, did you survey for fish underneath each cage where most of the debris can be found from the cage?
Yeah, so I had great plans to try and very intensively survey and drop my cameras around a site to try and get as many different sites as possible, but what we found was that actually accessibility was a huge issue. The deployment boat wasn't going to be able to reach some of these areas because of all the floating cables and pipes, etc., etc. And eventually we had to settle on a location at the farms that was decided by the farm manager. Luckily, the locations for the drops, they were in the same location at each farm, but they were quite close to the cages. They were as close as we could pretty much get at that time. So they were not directly underneath, but they were fairly close, close enough to actually see debris and see the seabed basically at that point. So yeah, there's definitely that can definitely be looked at in greater detail if that is explored further. Thanks, Vincent.
And next question is from Rhiannon saying, great presentation. They are wondering if there was a specific frequency band that ADDs output at, and if with any of your CPOD modifications, you were able to exclude the ADD signals.
Yeah, so the ADD, at the time of my research, there was multiple ADD brands that are being used across the West Coast, and there's a few different types. Some most commonly used ones were centered around 10 kilohertz at frequency, but as you can see from some of the spectrograms that I showed earlier, some of those frequencies do reach much higher than that just when they're combined. However, the CPOD modification was basically trying to ignore all that. That was really trying to narrow that frequency down into the 100 to 160 kilohertz, which technically speaking shouldn't be within any ADD noise production. And that it did work to an extent, and it did allow that monitoring to go without having that saturation occurring. It's just unfortunate in the timing and that those experiments that resulted in that CPOD modification didn't actually happen and get decided upon until the start of the end of monitoring. So I have all these years of monitoring effort, mainly with standard CPODs, where the modified ones were used more towards the end. So that's why I can't really answer that presence absence question with ADDs or without ADDs.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question is from David, also saying that great talk, and they ask, can you tell us how many ADD units were associated with each cage on the farm, and what source or received decibel levels you recorded from them?
Thanks, David. I knew you'd be asking some questions about that. Basically, the number of ADDs on each cage depended on the farm. The bigger farms tended to have one on each cage, but through multiple cages. So, you know, a 12 cage site would have one in each. And then sometimes some farms have two on the outer extent of the cage group. It really depended on the site. but certainly some of the larger farms did have quite a number of units on the farm. And with the source receive levels, that wasn't something I was looking at with my recordings. I was looking for characterizations of signals, not sound levels and sound measurements, but that simply because of where I was putting my sound traps and the necessary work you need to do to establish those sound level measurements was not part of the study. But yeah, I know you're interested in that sort of thing. Unfortunately, I can't give you that information because it wasn't part of it. Thanks.
This is a question from me. I don't know too much about the regulations of ADD units. Is there a limit to how many a farm or units can be had on a particular farm? Is there like a cutoff point if someone wanted to invest a lot?
So this is a really interesting question. ADDs are a real hot potato right now. The kind of legislation and use of them seems to be constantly changing. Really up to during my research, there were restrictions on farms, and certainly in some areas with porpoises that they weren't allowed to use farm ADDs. But in terms of how many you can use when you were allowed to use them, there wasn't really much guidance there, and it really came down to manufacturers' recommendations. And what they usually try to do is recommend a fence system where you've got output of noise around your farm, which that's why some farms would have 2 transducers on the edge cage of the cage group to try and complete a sound field around. There's not a lot of research about effectiveness in terms of number of transducers, or there's not much out there. So it was really a kind of it was a bit of a higgledy-piggledy thing with people using different types and different numbers. So yeah, not a lot of advice on exactly what works.
Okay, great. We're going to move on to the next question that's in the Q&A. They ask, when you found that some farms had low porpoise detection and some had high detection, do you think that this was to do with other variables, such as maybe a better porpoise habitat?
Absolutely. I mean, that is absolutely something that could be considered. What would be interesting is to work the data into a way that you can model all of the sites together. I modeled them separately because I assumed that the differences between sites in terms of things I wasn't including within that model would be too great to unpin from a big model, including them all. However, there are definitely ways to include all of that. So you could use your site as one of these variables to understand it, is it a site related thing? And I'm certainly with some of the higher detection rate sites like Port and Crow, the one I showed you, is in a really nice porpoise habitat. So yeah, that's likely to be something that comes into it.
There was also a second part to the question which asked, also, did the variation in level of detection always correlate with the use of ADDs at the farms that had ADDs?
So that wasn't something that I could unpin, basically because of the issues with the monitoring effort with CPODs and ADDs. That question couldn't really be tackled. It was just an unfortunate part of doing the study in a place that had never been done before. We didn't know how CPODs would react to being put in a area with ADDs. So the levels of detections are largely unrelated to ADD use because of that monitoring effort gap.
Right, understood. And we have one last question, which I'll read out in just a minute. So if anyone who's still with us has a question for Texa, then please just pop it in that Q&A box at the bottom and we'll work through it. That last question is asking, are the data sets for sun angle, dial time, and all the other aspects such as temperature that you used open access? Where did you get that?
So some of them are. Sun angle it's from a package in R called SunCalc. It's a fantastic thing, and it gives you a lot of different environmental variables, time related, that you can use with your location. You can pop that stuff out. So the Westcom's data is it's through SAMS. If you're interested in using that, contact SAMS, contact Dima. He is the maker of this incredible resource, and he's more than happy to share that information. And it does provide a lot of different parameters, including water temperature, etc.
And yeah, so please just drop Texa an email as well if there's something that you want to follow up with her. Another question that has just snuck in saying, when the porpoises were detected in their cages when ADDs were in use, how long did they spend there?
So that it's unfortunately yet another aspect of this is that there's no way to tell. So the detections of the porpoises during the ADD use was literally in that small gap where the sea pod was detecting noise and recording and then stopped. So it was literally a couple of seconds. So whether the porpoises maintained themselves in that area while the sea pod was not recording is possible, of course. And I would suggest that because of that nature, the nature of that effort logging, it's likely that what I'm seeing is an underestimation of how often this is happening. In terms of time, I wouldn't know from those data, but that certainly would be interesting to find out in terms of how long they're exposed to these noise levels and how that impacts their hearing thresholds.
Great, thank you. We have no more questions to work through. So, and we have gone over time. So please, everyone, thank you so much for joining today. And thank you so much, Texa, for today's MASTS webinar. Please contact Texa if you have any questions that you would like to follow up on as well. And oh, there might be one more that's just snuck in. Nope, they're just saying great. So I think everyone's really happy with your talk. Texa, there's been a lot of positive messages coming in on the chat as well. So thank you very much, Texa.